Nathan Whitmore thought he was marrying the woman of his dreams, but when he discovered that his bride, Claire, was having a secret affair with his father, Gerald, the betrayal ignited a deadly spiral that ended in murder, manipulation, and a family's darkest secrets unraveling before the world. Nathan Whitmore grew up in a world of glass towers, fine suits, and elegant dinners, shaped by the commanding presence of his father, Gerald Whitmore. Gerald was a real estate magnate in Seattle with a reputation for dominance in both boardrooms and family matters. Nathan, his only child, had lived in the shadow of that legacy his entire life. But unlike his father, Nathan chose a quieter path. He pursued architecture, creating beauty from structure, preferring precision and purpose over cutthroat competition. Despite the contrast in their personalities, the father and son maintained a complicated bond, one woven with unspoken expectations and the weight of a powerful name. At 32, Nathan had built a respectable career. His projects earned praise, though he avoided the media spotlight his father often relished. Friends described him as disciplined, kind, and a little too trusting. He had always been more of a listener than a talker, a trait that would one day become both his strength and his downfall. It was at a charity gala benefiting homeless youth, an event his firm sponsored, where he met Claire. Claire arrived late that evening, slipping into the room with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere. She was beautiful in a precise, polished way, red lips, dark eyes, and a grace that drew people's attention without effort. Nathan noticed her almost immediately, not because she was the loudest or most glamorous, but because she seemed untouched by the desperation that clung to so many in the room. She was composed, calm, and entirely in control. By the end of the evening, they had shared a conversation over champagne and exchanged numbers. Their courtship unfolded quickly. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Claire said she worked in luxury event planning, and Nathan didn't press for details. She knew which wine to order at dinner, how to handle difficult waitstaff, and what topics to avoid at public gatherings. Nathan, often awkward in social settings, leaned on her presence like a crutch. With her, he felt seen and understood in ways he had never experienced before. She asked about his childhood, his work, his dreams, and unlike others, she didn't seem intimidated by the Whitmore name. When Claire met Gerald for the first time, it was during a dinner at the Whitmore estate. Gerald was charming and oddly curious about her background, asking questions that seemed harmless but were designed to measure and assess. Claire, to her credit, held her own. She smiled when she needed to, offered vague but convincing stories about her past, and made a point of complimenting the artwork on the walls, pieces Gerald had collected over decades. At the end of the night, Gerald pulled Nathan aside and simply said, "She's different." It wasn't approval, nor disapproval, just an observation. The months passed and their relationship deepened. Nathan proposed during a trip to Napa Valley, presenting her with a vintage diamond ring that had belonged to his mother. Claire said yes with tears in her eyes. The engagement was celebrated widely. Gerald hosted a formal gathering to announce it to the extended family and their social circle. Claire quickly became the center of attention. She was adored, admired, and envied. Her presence seemed to soften Gerald, who had grown colder after the death of his wife years earlier. Planning the wedding took 6 months. It was Claire's domain. Nathan remained focused on work, happy to let her handle the details. But as the date approached, he began to notice small things, whispered conversations between Claire and Gerald, moments that lingered longer than they should have, laughter that felt too personal. He dismissed them, trusting both of them blindly. Gerald had always been a distant father, but he never believed him capable of overstepping that boundary. And Claire, despite her air of mystery, had never given him a reason to question her loyalty. The wedding was held at Gerald S. private estate just outside the city, an expansive property with manicured lawns, a marble fountain, and enough space to host 200 guests. It was a sunlit afternoon, and everything went perfectly. Claire walked down the aisle in a silk gown that shimmered with every step. Nathan looked at her as if nothing else existed. To him, that moment was pure, untouched by suspicion or doubt. Guests clapped, photographers snapped away, and the Whitmore legacy seemed ready to pass peacefully from father to son. Later that evening, during the reception, Gerald made a toast that struck some as unusually sentimental. He spoke of love and legacy, of letting go and embracing the future. Claire stood beside him, her hand lightly on his arm, smiling in a way that some later described as too familiar. But in the moment, it all seemed perfect. Nathan danced with his new bride under string lights, unaware that the woman in his arms had already betrayed him in the most devastating way. After the wedding, they moved into a luxury apartment gifted by Gerald. Claire decorated it to her taste. Minimalist, expensive, and cold. Nathan didn't mind. He was busy with work, designing a new community center downtown. Claire said she wanted to start her own business, something in luxury branding. He supported her idea, even loaned her some money to get started. What he didn't know was that the business was never real. It was a cover, a distraction, a way to explain her frequent disappearances. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic between Gerald and Claire became more pronounced. She visited him often under the guise of discussing real estate deals. Nathan, assuming she was simply involving herself in the family business, encouraged the connection. Gerald had never been particularly warm with anyone, and this newfound bond seemed at first like a positive change. But beneath the surface, something far more sinister was unfolding. Claire and Gerald had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, long before Nathan ever said, "I do." Their affair was not a one-time lapse in judgment. It was ongoing, calculated, and deliberate. They thought they could keep it hidden, maintain the illusion, and get away with everything. And for a time, they did. Nathan, ever trusting and hopeful, had no idea that his wedding was not the beginning of something beautiful, but the foundation of his own destruction. The truth, when it came, would not just shatter his heart. It would shatter everything. Claire's behavior began to shift in subtle but unsettling ways, just weeks after the wedding. She became more distant, often distracted, and her once affectionate nature turned cool and transactional. She started leaving early in the morning and coming home late at night, always with explanations that seemed rehearsed. She claimed to be meeting potential investors for her luxury branding business, but Nathan could never quite pin down any details. Names were vague, meetings untraceable. When he asked questions, she smiled sweetly and changed the subject, expertly steering the conversation elsewhere. Nathan, still wanting to believe in the life they had just begun, tried to convince himself that he was overthinking it. Their home, once filled with soft laughter and shared dinners, grew silent. Nathan often found himself eating alone, walking through the apartment with its pristine decor and sterile charm, feeling more like a guest than a husband. The warmth he had imagined filling their life together never arrived. Claire's touch was absent, her presence ghostly, and yet she maintained the facade of a loving wife in public. She held his arm at events, smiled in photos, and spoke of their plans to start a family one day. But in private, she was unreachable. Nathan's unease grew heavier each day. One evening, while Claire was supposedly out meeting with a potential business partner, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She had forgotten it in her rush out the door. Nathan stared at the screen, the notification lighting up again. It was a message preview from a contact saved simply as G. His stomach turned. He picked up the phone and hesitated, but curiosity and dread overpowered guilt. He unlocked it with the passcode he knew and opened the messages. What he saw destroyed him. The thread was long, filled with affectionate language, suggestive photos, and plans that should have never existed between a married woman and anyone, let alone her husband's father. The messages weren't new. They dated back months, some even before he had proposed. The betrayal wasn't accidental. It was long-term, consistent, and deeply personal. Gerald and Claire had been seeing each other all along, manipulating Nathan, mocking the life he believed he was building. His hands shook as he scrolled further, uncovering more of their twisted reality. They had discussed financial transfers, private weekends at Gerald's secondary properties, and even the legal implications of Claire's marriage to Nathan. It wasn't love. It was a calculated alliance. Claire had seduced Gerald, and Gerald had willingly participated, knowing full well the pain it would cause his son. Nathan's entire world collapsed in that moment. He sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the cold, clinical design of the apartment, clutching a truth that burned through every part of him. It wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation, engineered by the two people he trusted most. The messages exposed not just an affair, but a plan to dismantle him emotionally, financially, and socially. Claire hadn't married Nathan out of love. She had done so out of strategy. Gerald had played along, funding her efforts, guiding her path, and ultimately ensuring that his son would be outmaneuvered. That night, Nathan packed a bag and left without saying a word. He didn't sleep. He drove aimlessly for hours, eventually checking into a motel far from the city. He didn't answer Claire's calls. He didn't confront her, not yet. He needed time to think, to make sense of the chaos. The man he had idolized had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. The woman he had loved had used him as a pawn in a sick, strategic game. In the days that followed, Claire continued to reach out. Her tone shifted from concern to confusion, and finally to coldness. Gerald, too, reached out, not with apologies, but with explanations Nathan didn't even read. Nathan stayed in hiding, speaking only to a longtime friend from college, someone who had always warned him that Claire's story didn't add up. With his friend's help, Nathan secured a lawyer and filed for divorce within a week. The divorce papers were delivered to Claire by a process server. She responded by hiring one of the city's most aggressive attorneys. What should have been a simple, swift separation turned into a battle. Claire claimed emotional distress, a lack of financial support, and requested a significant portion of Nathan's inheritance, including one of the luxury properties recently transferred from Gerald to Nathan as a wedding gift. It was a calculated move. Claire's legal team used Nathan's family name against him, painting him as controlling and emotionally unstable. Gerald, unsurprisingly, backed Claire financially, funding her legal campaign and attending hearings by her side. The public didn't know the full story, and the media, hungry for a scandal, spun it into a sensational mess. Headlines speculated about family feuds, hidden affairs, and whispers of betrayal. But the truth remained buried beneath legal red tape and polite deception. Nathan watched helplessly as his life unraveled. His reputation in the architecture community took a hit. Clients withdrew projects. Invitations stopped coming. Friends distanced themselves, unsure which version of the story to believe. Even worse, Gerald's influence loomed like a shadow, making it nearly impossible for Nathan to defend himself without exposing the ugly truth. To do so would mean destroying his father's legacy publicly, something Nathan had spent his entire life trying to uphold. In private, Nathan hired a private investigator. He needed answers, proof that this wasn't just a personal betrayal, but a larger scheme. The investigator worked quietly, uncovering damning evidence. Claire had assumed new identities in other cities, had been married twice before, and in both cases had walked away with significant assets. Her past was riddled with strategic relationships, carefully constructed lies, and sudden exits. She was, by every definition, a professional manipulator. Meanwhile, surveillance confirmed that Claire was still visiting Gerald. The affair hadn't ended. In fact, it had grown bolder. They no longer cared about discretion. They were living openly, almost defiantly, as if daring the world to question their morality. Nathan sank deeper into despair. His name, his future, and his sense of reality had been stolen from him. He barely recognized the man he saw in the mirror. He was hollowed out, a shell of the person who had once believed in love, trust, and loyalty. But beneath that emptiness, something darker began to grow. A slow, simmering rage. What they had done wasn't just betrayal. It was psychological warfare. They had twisted love into a weapon, and Nathan was left bleeding, both emotionally and socially. He had lost everything. And as he stared at the final set of photos from the investigator, images of Claire and Gerald leaving a luxury hotel, arm in arm, a thought began to crystallize in his mind. If justice couldn't be found in the courts, he would find it another way. Nathan no longer saw the world the same way. The betrayal had reshaped his view of everything and everyone around him. His days blurred together in a haze of silence and anger. He stopped answering phone calls, ignored messages from coworkers, and disconnected from the life he had once carefully built. The apartment he had fled from remained untouched, just as Claire had left it. His former friends grew tired of trying to reach him, and even the few who remained loyal didn't know how to help. He was unraveling in private, while Claire and Gerald paraded their lives as if nothing had ever happened. Nathan spent his days in his small rented flat on the outskirts of the city, obsessively analyzing everything: texts, emails, photos, old receipts. He mapped out timelines, tracked phone records, and compiled folders of evidence from the private investigator. He created a web on his wall, connecting dates and locations, drawing lines between Gerald's business transactions and Claire's sudden interest in the Whitmore estate. The puzzle slowly came together, revealing not a spontaneous affair, but a premeditated plan. One discovery hit Nathan harder than the rest. Several months before the wedding, Gerald had secretly set up a trust fund in Claire's name. Large assets had been quietly moved: real estate, stocks, even heirlooms that were once part of Nathan's inheritance. All of it was handed over to Claire. It was proof that the plan had been in motion long before Nathan had ever proposed. He wasn't just a victim of a failed relationship. He had been targeted, deceived, and used as a pawn in a scheme orchestrated by his own father. Nathan wondered why. Why would Gerald, a man obsessed with family legacy and public image, destroy his son's life? Why would he gamble everything for a woman nearly half his age, one with a suspicious history and no genuine affection for him? The answer, Nathan believed, was power. Gerald had always controlled everything: his business, his reputation, and his son's path. Perhaps seducing Claire was his final move in a lifelong game of control. And Claire, always drawn to influence and wealth, had found the perfect partner in Gerald. The investigator Nathan had hired provided even more disturbing findings. Claire had changed her name twice before moving to Seattle. Her previous marriages ended in sealed settlements. One former husband had lost a substantial portion of his company after a swift and brutal divorce. Another had faced legal troubles soon after their separation. Allegations of fraud and embezzlement that some believed Claire had helped to orchestrate. None of it was proven, but the patterns were impossible to ignore. Nathan considered going to the police or the press, but what could he truly prove? He had no concrete evidence of criminal activity, just betrayal, manipulation, and moral decay. And exposing it all would also expose himself, the man who had failed to see the truth, the man who had loved blindly, and the man whose name had been used as a stepping stone. The shame was suffocating. One afternoon, Nathan visited his childhood home, which had been sitting vacant since his mother's death. It was the only place that still felt real. Dust covered the furniture, the scent of old books and time lingering in the air. He walked through each room, remembering moments of warmth with his mother, moments of discipline with his father, and moments of solitude that defined his youth. On the mantel, a framed photo of Gerald, Nathan, and his mother remained. The perfect family portrait. A lie, like everything else. He stared at that photo for a long time, studying the expressions. His father's grip on his shoulder now seemed possessive, not proud. His mother's smile looked forced, her eyes distant. And Nathan, young, hopeful, oblivious. The family he thought he had never truly existed. It was in that house, surrounded by memories and ghosts, that Nathan's thoughts darkened. The humiliation Gerald had inflicted, the way Claire had infiltrated their lives and walked away with everything, it was too much to bear. They had taken not just his dignity, but his identity, and no one would ever hold them accountable. Nathan began making plans, not rushed or impulsive, but precise. He reviewed the building's access codes, mapped out Gerald's routine, and identified blind spots in the estate's security. It wasn't difficult. Gerald's arrogance made him careless. He believed he was untouchable, even in his most intimate spaces. Nathan knew better. He knew where his father kept the keys, where the cameras were positioned, and when the staff rotated shifts. He returned to his flat and retrieved the handgun he had inherited from his grandfather. A relic, never fired, but still functional. He cleaned it, loaded it, and wrapped it in a cloth. There was no rush. He wanted to wait for the right night, the right moment when Gerald would be alone. Not just for opportunity, but for symbolism. He wanted Gerald to feel what he had felt: betrayal, isolation, and fear. In the days leading up to his decision, Nathan followed Gerald from a distance. He watched as his father dined with Claire, bought her gifts, and smiled like a man who had everything. Claire wore expensive clothes, flaunted her new car, and walked through the city like she owned it. She never looked over her shoulder. Neither of them expected consequences. They believed Nathan had disappeared into silence, broken and defeated. But silence can be deceiving. The night Nathan chose was cold and clear. Gerald's penthouse lights were on, but the staff had already left. Claire had not been seen arriving that evening. It was the perfect window. Nathan entered through the service elevator using an old access card Gerald had never deactivated. He moved through the halls silently, his footsteps muffled by plush carpets. The house smelled of scotch and cologne, the air warm with false comfort. He found Gerald in his study, seated at his desk with a glass of whiskey in hand. Gerald didn't hear Nathan enter. He was reading a document, relaxed, unaware that the balance of power was about to shift forever. Nathan raised the gun and aimed it at the man who had destroyed his life. Gerald turned just in time to see his son's face, but there were no words, no pleas, no recognition of guilt. Just shock, perhaps fear, and then nothing. A single shot rang out. It was quick, efficient, final. Nathan didn't linger. He opened the safe behind the desk, removed a folder of documents and a stack of cash, and wiped down every surface he had touched. Then he vanished into the night, calm and methodical, his heart steady. What he didn't know was that Claire had been watching from a security feed, something Gerald had installed weeks earlier without telling anyone. She had seen everything, and now she had exactly what she needed. Not to mourn, not to grieve, but to use it. Claire watched the grainy footage in silence, her face expressionless as Nathan pulled the trigger. The dim lighting of Gerald's study captured everything. The entry, the confrontation, the execution. It was quiet, cold, and clean. She leaned back in her chair and paused the video, rewinding it slowly. She studied Nathan's face as he left, the eerie calm in his eyes, the precision of his movements. She wasn't surprised. She had always known there was something darker beneath his quiet demeanor. It was what made him predictable, controllable, useful. The security system had been upgraded only a month prior, a decision Gerald made after an anonymous tip warned him about potential threats. Ironically, the threat had come from within, and now that same system gave Claire the ultimate advantage. She copied the footage to a hidden drive, secured it in her desk, and erased the original copy from the server. It was a bargaining chip she didn't intend to waste. Gerald's body was discovered the next morning by his housekeeper. The police arrived swiftly. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious motive, and very little evidence. The room had been wiped clean, the cameras appeared disabled, and Gerald's death, though clearly a homicide, raised more questions than it answered. The media exploded with speculation. A wealthy tycoon dead in his own home, no known enemies, no suspects. Claire, in a composed display of grief, issued a public statement expressing heartbreak and vowing to assist law enforcement in any way possible. Privately, she did nothing. Claire played the role of the mourning partner perfectly. Dressed in black, she appeared at the memorial, received condolences, and accepted offers of sympathy from business associates, investors, and distant relatives. Her eyes were glassy but dry. Her voice never cracked. She wore her sadness like designer clothing, visible, elegant, and just believable enough. Behind closed doors, however, she began restructuring her future. With Gerald gone, most of his assets passed to her. The trust fund he had created was ironclad, and Nathan's involvement in his father's death, if proven, would legally disqualify him from inheritance. Claire knew this. She had studied the documents thoroughly. The only obstacle left, was ensuring Nathan remained unaware of the footage's existence. For now, he was still a ghost, vanished after the murder. The police had no leads, and no one had connected the dots between father and son. Claire intended to keep it that way until it no longer served her. Weeks passed. Claire moved into a new property in Napa, far from the whispers and scrutiny of Seattle. She told friends she needed time to heal. In reality, she was consolidating power. She met with lawyers, investors, and private advisors. Her image as Gerald's grieving partner gave her access to everything: his board seat, his foundation, and his wealth. There were a few raised eyebrows, of course. Some people questioned her rapid rise and sharp focus, but none dared accuse her of manipulation. Not yet. Nathan, meanwhile, was unraveling. He lived under a false name, drifting between motels, occasionally checking news updates for any developments in the case. When Gerald's death was officially ruled a homicide with no suspects, he felt a wave of relief, but also paranoia. He had expected the act to give him closure. Instead, it gave him more questions. He couldn't sleep. He saw his father's face every night, the lifeless stare, the finality. The satisfaction he had imagined never came. Instead, he was haunted by the silence that followed. He tried to convince himself that justice had been served, that he had balanced the scales. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Claire was too quiet, too composed. He began to wonder if she knew more than she let on. One night, while browsing through a burner laptop in a remote motel, Nathan found an article that stopped him cold. It showed Claire at a charity gala in Napa, standing next to a senator, smiling, glowing. She wore Gerald's favorite necklace, one Nathan had seen on his mother years before. In the photo's background, partially blurred, was the same security consultant Gerald had hired before his death. Panic set in. Nathan began retracing his steps, realizing where he might have gone wrong. He remembered the camera above the hallway, the one he assumed was off. He had checked the system, but what if Gerald had a backup? What if Claire had access to it? The thought chilled him. If she had the footage, she owned him. He became more cautious, changing hotels frequently, avoiding technology, and staying off-grid. But the paranoia only grew. Claire was already preparing her next move. She contacted a man named Avery Darnell, a retired intelligence contractor turned private fixer. He specialized in insurance, discreet leverage to keep people in check. Claire handed him the drive containing the footage and instructed him to monitor Nathan's movements. She didn't want him arrested, at least not yet. She wanted him contained, broken. The idea wasn't just to keep Nathan silent, but to use his crime as protection. If he ever threatened her publicly, she could end him with a single clip. Avery accepted the job without question. For the right price, he'd do anything. As the months passed, Claire expanded her reach. She invested in biotech firms, entered the philanthropic circuit, and used Gerald's name to open doors Nathan never could. Her reputation slowly morphed into one of resilience and brilliance, a woman who had endured loss and risen stronger. The media adored her, boardrooms respected her, and behind the scenes she remained untouchable. But Nathan wasn't finished. Tormented and sleepless, he began writing a journal. It was part confession, part accusation, a complete record of everything that had happened. He described the manipulation, the affair, the betrayal, and the murder. He included copies of documents from the private investigator, his own recollections, and suspicions that Claire had orchestrated everything from the start. The journal grew thicker by the day. He mailed copies of it anonymously to a few journalists and one detective he trusted in Seattle. He told himself it was insurance. If anything happened to him, the truth would surface. What he didn't know was that Avery was already closing in. One night in a rundown motel in Oregon, Nathan woke to find his door slightly ajar. Nothing appeared stolen, but his journal was gone. He checked the desk drawer, empty. The USB drives were missing. Panic washed over him. Whoever had taken them had moved silently, efficiently, leaving no trace. Claire received a message that night from Avery. Package secured. He's losing control. She exhaled slowly, satisfied. Nathan had just become a whisper in the wind, a broken man with no voice and no proof. Everything was falling into place. But what Claire failed to see, blinded by her own ambition, was that one journalist had already opened the package Nathan mailed. And what they found inside was enough to change everything. The envelope arrived in a nondescript brown package with no return address. Investigative journalist Leah Morgan almost threw it out, assuming it was another baseless tip from a conspiracy theorist. But something about the weight of the envelope and the care in how it was sealed made her pause. Inside was a thick handwritten journal accompanied by photocopies of documents, photographs, and financial statements. The cover page read simply, "For the record, Nathan Whitmore." Leah read the entire journal that night. By morning, she had a story that could shake the core of a powerful legacy and implicate a grieving widow in one of the most calculated betrayals she had ever seen. Nathan had detailed everything, from the engagement with Claire to the discovery of her affair with his father, Gerald Whitmore. The documents supported claims of premeditated manipulation, the trust fund transfers, the shell corporations, the redacted marriage contracts. There was no hard proof Claire orchestrated the murder, but the journal made a strong case that she had engineered everything leading up to it, and possibly even intended to trap Nathan. Leah had seen similar cases before, but this one was different. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about legacy, control, and a family torn apart from within. Before publishing anything, she contacted her editor and brought in legal counsel to verify the claims. Every name mentioned was cross-checked. The trust documents matched public records. The property transfers aligned with Gerald's estate filings. Even the private investigator Nathan had hired was real, though now missing, unreachable for weeks. By the end of the week, Leah had drafted an exposé under the working title, Inheritance of Deceit, The Whitmore Affair. But before going public, she wanted more. If there was even a grain of truth to Nathan's story, there had to be surveillance footage, proof of the murder.
Leah began digging into Gerald Whitmore's estate and discovered through city planning records that the penthouse had undergone a security system upgrade just months before his death. The company that installed it had ties to a former intelligence contractor, Avery Darnell. When Leah reached out to Darnell's firm, she was met with resistance.
No one would confirm or deny anything about the system or any recovered footage. But Leah wasn't easily discouraged. She contacted a former tech associate who once worked on embedded surveillance systems. Together, they scoured dark web forums and private info brokering sites. After days of silence, a message popped up. "You're looking for the Whitmore footage. I have something you want." The source offered a 15-second clip for a price. Leah negotiated. She didn't know how the footage had leaked, but once she received the clip and confirmed its authenticity, There was no doubt. It showed Nathan entering the study. The image cut just before the shot, but the implication was obvious. The timestamp matched the police report. The murder, once a mystery, had a face. Leah now had a moral dilemma. She held the truth in her hands, but revealing it could mean exposing a man whose only crime was vengeance for a betrayal few could ever imagine. Was it justice or cold-blooded murder? And what about Claire? If Nathan's journal was true, then Claire had not only destroyed a family but had manipulated two men into ruining each other while walking away unscathed. Before she could decide, her office was broken into. Nothing was stolen except the journal and the footage. Leah knew immediately who was behind it. Claire had grown used to being ahead of everyone. When she learned about the leaked package and Leah's investigation, she didn't panic, she acted. She called Avery, who had been tracking Leah's digital movements. They executed a quiet break-in and removed every trace of Nathan's confession. Claire believed it was over, that she had caught it just in time. But she underestimated Leah. The journalist had made digital copies. She had sent drafts of her article and the files to 3 trusted colleagues and scheduled an automatic release if anything happened to her. So when her apartment was ransacked 2 days later and her phone tapped, Leah went public. The article dropped across major media outlets simultaneously. It detailed everything: the betrayal, the trust fund scheme, the suspicious death, and the footage. The story spread like wildfire. Public opinion was swift and brutal. While Claire issued a statement denying any wrongdoing, claiming Nathan was mentally unstable and grieving, few believed her. Gerald's former business partners began backing away. Investigations were launched into Claire's finances and her prior marriages. Old lawsuits were unearthed. Alleged victims came forward. Her empire, carefully built on charm and deceit, started to collapse. But Nathan wasn't celebrating. He had seen the article on a newsstand and knew it was over for everyone. His face was on every screen. His name was linked forever with murder. And while Claire's reputation was in flames, she still walked free. There were no direct charges, no official ties to the crime. The footage only showed him. The burden was his alone. One evening, weeks after the exposé, Nathan turned himself in. He walked into a police station in Portland, carrying only a small bag and a letter addressed to Leah Morgan. He confessed to the murder of Gerald Whitmore, accepted the consequences, and declined legal representation. In his statement, he made no excuses, only asked that the truth be known. His trial became a media circus. Prosecutors painted him as a vengeful son. The defense called it a crime of passion. The journal played a key role. So did the footage. But what struck the jury most was Nathan's demeanor. Calm, honest, exhausted. In the end, he was sentenced to 25 years, with the possibility of parole. The judge called it a tragedy born of betrayal. Claire was never charged, but her life was over in every way that mattered. Her finances were frozen pending civil lawsuits. Public foundations dropped her. Business ventures folded. She retreated to a private estate in Europe, away from cameras, from judgment, from power, alone. Leah published a book about the case titled The Son, the Bride, and the Betrayal. It became a bestseller. But she never forgot Nathan's letter. In it, he wrote, "This was never about revenge. It was about ending a lie. My only regret is that I didn't walk away when I had the chance. Maybe that is the real lesson. Some ghosts aren't meant to be fought. They are meant to be left behind. And so, The Whitmore legacy ended, not with a bang, but with the slow crumbling of trust, loyalty, and family. A murder that shocked a nation was never just about blood. It was about truth, and what happens when love is nothing more than leverage.